Now, I wanted to just say a few words to the grandchildren. I want you to know your grandfather was a great man. I want you to understand that. Now, you loved him because he was your grandpa. We loved him because who he was and what he did. So I want you to know that. You're lucky grandchildren that have a grandpa like Coleman Ginn. But let me tell you a little bit about Cole. You can read this bio. It says he was on the front page in the New York Times because of what he did at the Manhattan Center for Science and Math. I want you to know what Manhattan Center for Science and Math, Benjamin Franklin High School, was before Cole took over. Here are the statistics. I've said them 1,000 times, and I can't believe them. 7% of the youngsters who entered graduated. The attendance was 44%, and that was always taken prior to lunch. The handbook with 2 cross sneakers, because Benjamin Franklin were the state basketball champs. And Cole always would say, and the sneakers weren't even tied. And 4 years later, after closing Franklin, with the help of Frank Macchiarola, we became partners. Interesting, we're becoming partners again with another chancellor. It must be a good omen. And 4 years after opening the Manhattan Center for Science and Math, every single youngster graduated and went off to college. And that's what got Coleman on the front pages of the New York Times. And all of us in New York know nothing is real until it is in the New York Times, and once it's in the New York Times, it's real forever. But he had a corrupt, racist school board that thought he was a pushover because Cole spoke very softly. Very softly. Most people went to their hearing doctor after having a long conference with Cole. And he carried a wire for 6 months. His life was threatened many times. And he got these guys indicted and removed. That was a very courageous man. I called him the Serpico superintendent, but I was once, when he was testifying before the Gill Commission, I was down there, and a reporter said, "What do you think of this guy?" Of course, I didn't tell her I knew. I said, "Are you kidding? This guy is a major hero." And she went on the news that night, said, "A major hero reports to the Gill Commission." That Joel is our speaker is most appropriate because Cole loved the idea. And this reorganization that Joel is doing is not just another reorganization. This is a revolutionary change where we're bringing power to the school site. This will have national implications, and it's going to empower principals who are smart enough to be empowered. Now, Cole was empowered when he was a school teacher. And when he was principal of Manhattan Center, he had a wonderful plan that he worked out. He had 2 superintendents, one from the high school division and one from East Harlem District 4. And then he did whatever he wanted to do. And if anyone ever said anything, he'd say, if I said something, "Cole, how come you're doing it?" He says, "Well, the high school superintendent ordered me to do it." And when the high school superintendent objected to something, says, "District 4 superintendent ordered me to do this." So he was empowered long before anyone else was empowered. But he would greatly appreciate what you're doing, Joel. And the art here is going to be how many principals really take the power. Because most of the time, people veto themselves. And it was comfortable to say, the chancellor won't let me do this, the school board won't let me do this, my mother won't let me do this. That is all out now. Now principals can make decisions, and they can't veto themselves. They're going to have to do it, and I think your best principals are going to take that power and run with it. It also will empower teachers and parents, because people keep saying, well, what about the parents? The easiest place to organize parents is at the school site. Not citywide, let's organize the 1,200,000 parents, but at a school you can organize your parents and they will have tremendous input into decision-making in exchange for real accountability and pupil performance. So I thank you, Joel, for what you're doing. We at CEI support it tremendously. And believe it or not, his gang isn't large enough yet. He needs your support in this issue because there are many people who really like the status quo. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joel Klein, Chancellor.
Let me start with some basic facts. In the last couple of months, there are two facts that I think are critical about what's happening in public education under Michael Bloomberg in this city. First of all, we got nominated for the Broad Prize. Most people don't know what the Broad Prize is, but it's an annual prize given to the best performing urban school district in the country. They start with over 100, and each year they winnow it down to 5, and there are 5 finalists, and then there's a winner. For the last 2 years, we were one of the 5 finalists. Once again this year, we're one of the 5 finalists. Again, 3 years in a row, based on a rigorous analysis. And the reasons they give for New York is that we've outperformed comparable districts in our state, serving students with similar income levels in reading and math at every grade level. We also have outperformed the rest of the comparable districts on the performance of our low-income students, our African-American students, and our Hispanic students in every subgroup at every level. In addition, we're closing the achievement gap for Hispanics compared with white counterparts in high school reading and math and elementary school reading and math, and as African-Americans compared to their white counterparts in elementary and high school math. And lastly, we've increased significantly the rates of African-American and Hispanics taking the SAT exam. So the first point to know is across the board, in real apples-to-apples comparison, we're making progress. The second, and in my view, more important statistic is the one released by Commissioner Mills quite recently on the graduation rates. And there are several dimensions to it, and again, in the noise, it sometimes gets drowned out. But in the past 2 years, New York City took its graduation rate from 44 to 50%. I'll be the first to admit far too low, but 50% to 44 is a 6-point or 14% gain in 2 years. If we could keep on that pace, that would be significant. What makes it even more important is that the other large cities in our state went down 4% during that 10 years. And indeed, the entire rest of the state went down 2 points. Another significant data point that I want to highlight is our 5-year rate. In other words, 5-year graduation rate went up 10 points, while the other large cities went up 6 points and the rest of the state went up 4 points. So in every dimension, not just 4-year, but 4-year, 5-year, 6-year, we are moving forward and closing the gap. And as important as that is, I want you to know that that is not a place to rest, but a place to build on. That if we stayed on that path, we would not get done the work we need to do. And in my remarks today, I want to convince you of 3 fundamental points, because I think these are the critical points in educational reform in the United States. First of all, we have a crisis. And many people in this country do not realize the dimensions of the crisis we face. And the complacency we feel nationally in the face of this crisis is something we need to change. There is a racial and ethnic achievement gap that is the shame of this, the greatest nation on earth. 53 years after Brown versus Board of Education, as early as the 3rd grade, the average black and Latino child is significantly behind the average white kid. And by the time they get to high school, a 17-year-old African-American kid, and that doesn't include the kids who've already dropped out, a 17-year-old African-American Latino kid is more than 4 years behind a comparable child, so performing at the level of a 13-year-old white child. And when they go to college, those who do, African-American and Latino kids increasingly are needing remedial work. Now, that racial achievement gap is reason enough for people to think that we need to do something very differently, but it's now going to be exacerbated significantly by a global achievement gap. I sat next to Claire Flom at lunch. The first point she made was just that point. I think most people don't know this, but on international tests, when they compare America to the industrialized countries in the OECD, on math in high school and middle school, we're 21 out of 29, 24 out of 29, and that doesn't even take into account the growing threat that's going to come from India and China and other parts of the world that are ready to compete with us. And when you look at, for example, a percent of our kids graduating college and compare it to other countries, on all of these metrics, we do not have a good story to tell. And so to me, if you look at it in our city, I think the only diploma ultimately that's going to matter, and I give the regents and Merrill Tisch, Harry Phillips are here, if there are others, forgive me, but I give them great credit because they've now said that going forward in years to come, only a regent's diploma will count. If only a regent's diploma counts, slightly more than a quarter of our African and Latino kids are getting a regent's diploma in New York City. And I did a study to show that there are now 140,000 children that are out there who either have already dropped out between the ages of 16 and 21 or are on their way to dropping out. 140,000 kids. If that were a high school district in the United States, it'd be the third largest high school district after New York and Los Angeles. So I don't want to upset you over lunch, but I hope you have some dimensions of the problem. Second point, and this is a point that's hard to convince many people of, but it's absolutely demonstrable empirically, and that is, it doesn't have to be that way. We hear so many reasons exogenous to the school system about why it is that our kids are not performing. But there are schools out there with the very same kids who are getting entirely different results. Look, I know the challenges of educating kids who grow up in poverty, who come from challenging families, and so on and so on. But the fact is, we can do an entirely different job. If you haven't read it, take a look at Paul Tuff's piece in the November 26th New York Times Magazine from last year, What It Takes to Make a Student. I can show you example after example. Indeed, I can make it easy for you because I can show you middle schools. So I know where the kids start. There's a middle school in New Haven I've studied carefully. And I can show you where their proficiency rate where they started was about 25 or 30%, same as New Haven. And the Connecticut proficiency rate was about 65%. By the time those kids, every one of them African American and Latino, graduated, those kids were at 80% proficiency. The state was actually stagnant, and New Haven was stagnant. So they had moved from comparability to a low-performing city to exceeding probably the highest performing state in the Union, all with African American and Latino kids. And I could give you example after example. I don't want to embarrass anybody. There are people in this room that are doing that kind of work today. The question I ask is, if that's true, why do we accept the facts that I started with? Why do we tolerate that? And the answer is because fundamentally we are not prepared to make the tough changes that we need to make to truly transform education in the city. You know, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to get the same results. Article after article, whether it's Charles Payne, the Duke professor, who's written an article called So Much Reform, So Little Change, whether it's Rick Hess at AEI, who talks about the spinning wheels of school reform. And you know, every one of these things, what do they talk about? You know, it's the same discussion over and over again. It's about curriculum, extended day, extended year, teacher certification, class size, on, programmatic issues. Now let me make clear, each one of those things is important. And I think you've got to get each one of them right. I think curriculums aren't as rigorous as they should be, obviously extended time, et cetera, et cetera. But the fundamental fact is that if you focus on those issues and a derivative of those issues, how much we spend on those issues, you'll continue to get the same results we're getting. You have any doubt about this? Take a look at the District of Columbia. They spend over $20,000 a kid, they have low class sizes, they have all these other things, and they get results that are abysmal, that are shockingly worse than we get in New York. Look at our colleagues in New Jersey in the Abbott case, which was like our CFE case. They're now spending in New Jersey over $18,000 a year per kid to get results that are worse than mine in places like Newark and Jersey City and elsewhere. So if we continue to focus on that part of the problem, we're going to miss the story. Now, Joe Williams is sitting out there. When he was a Daily News reporter, early in my tenure, wrote this story. It's a story I remember vividly. It's about a school in Washington Heights, right? They had a leaky roof and the gym floor buckled underneath. They called the school facilities organization 3 months later. We don't want to rush these things. Guy comes out and he says, I'm here to fix the floor. Principal, this is one of these principals Sy is talking about. The principal fundamentally says to him, fix the floor. He says, you got to fix the roof first. Guy says, look, bub, I'm a floor man. They sent me here to do the floor. I'm doing the floor. Principal goes to try to chase down his supervisor. In the meantime, the guy fixes the floor. The roof continues to leak and the floor buckles again. That's what we're doing in public education. It's important to fix the floor. As a kid who grew up loving gym, shooting hoops, I get the importance. I get the importance of all these issues. But if we don't fix the roof, we are not going to succeed in what we're trying to do here, the systemic way. We'll have these isolated islands of excellence, but we will not have systemic reform. And that's what I think the reforms that the mayor announced in January are all about. They are not the end game, but they are a critical point from which to move forward from those results that I talked to you about at the outset. You can go throughout America. You won't hear a school reform proposal that rests, as Michael Bloomberg says, on the 3 pillars of leadership, empowerment, and accountability. Right? You can show me no other city where that is true. And that goes to a fundamental sense of the way we organize to do the work. And if you don't organize to do the work properly, you won't get the work properly done. The roof will continue to leak, and the floor will continue to buckle. Now, at the last CEI event where my Chief Operating Officer, Kristen Kane, talked, she discussed at length some of these issues of empowerment. And Sy sort of nailed it today. He said, we will see which principals step up as they are empowered. But I think it's absolutely indispensable. When people tell me principals are not prepared to be responsible for their schools, when people say that to me, my answer is we have the wrong principle. Folks, if you don't create the conditions that'll attract talent to the system, then talent does not come. Indeed, one of the reasons so many leaders prefer to work in the charter movement is precisely because they feel empowered. But if we empower people, we will attract people who are up to the job. And indeed, they will teach us through differentiation rather than through top-down mandate what are the ways to succeed with highly challenging, and I understand the complexities, highly challenging populations. The system has to be built on meaningful accountability. Leadership and empowerment without real accountability is a prescription for failure and the status quo. And when I say accountability, we need to be able to differentiate the performance of the adults, administrators, teachers, and others in the system based on what they contribute to student performance. Now, a lot of people resist that idea. And one of the reasons they resist it is, quite frankly, I think NCLB focuses on the wrong set of metrics. I don't think the question is how many kids are proficient. That can depend on how you admit kids. It can depend on the neighborhood you live in. The question to me is how much gain. When I gave you that example from New Haven, that to me is what this is all about. If some kids who start at this level can be moved to that level, the question we need to ask ourselves is why aren't all kids being moved to that level? Under our new accountability system, which I was proud to announce here a little over a year and a half ago, that is exactly what we will be measuring. real apples to apples. So kids in schools that have lots of kids who are high performing, they will be compared to each other. And schools that have lots of kids in low performing, they will be compared to each other. And we'll look at the differentiation. That is the power. And there'll be real consequences. Now, you know, there's a lot of arguments. And in the last couple of months, a couple of very famous people have written a couple of books that I actually found very comforting in this question. Cy asks who's gang and who's in whose gang. You know, we don't like to talk that way. So I'm sure these people haven't joined my gang, but I find their words comforting. The first question you often hear a lot about is, well, you can't use test scores. That there's a problem with tests. And there's been a strong kind of, if you will, what my communications director calls testophobia. Now, I'll be the first to admit that you shouldn't only use tests, but standardized tests matter. And on this particular point, I think Chuck Schumer recently nailed it. He said every student in America should be tested on basic knowledge in a standardized way every year, calling for national tests. That's how we'll know that kids are learning and how well schools are teaching. This part of his plan, he says, is not voluntary. Each year, every student in the country will take a national test. Then he says, sometimes people complain about teaching to the test. They say that a standardized test replaces creativity with multiple choice. In truth, though, it's a false opposition. Standards and creativity are not in conflict. For most students, standards should be the beginning of education, not the end. If students are struggling and a teacher must choose between focusing on the national test and something else, the primary goal should be to teach the skills and knowledge that are on the test. Teaching the standardized test isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot better than teaching mush. And the second argument you get, and you get it time and time again, that there's something unfair or wrong about holding adults accountable for the performance of their students. And on that one, Bill Bradley just came out with a book. And in Bill Bradley's book, he says, there are some who argue that it's impossible to hold a teacher accountable for student performance. After all, they say, so many things happen outside the classroom that teachers cannot control. And he lists many of them that are familiar with you. And then he says, there are thousands of excuses, but that's all there are. They're excuses. And I think we've got to put our head around it, because if we do not differentiate the effects that the adults have on the kids, then we will continue not to focus on the kind of restructuring of a system that we need to get the work done. The kids with the greatest needs systematically are being denied access to an equitable share of high-quality teachers. Now, if you follow that through, you will see the nature of the challenge we face. Because take two schools in the city of New York, one of which, for every vacancy it has, it will have 100 or more qualified applicants. And this will be a highly sought-after school. Or take another school. And each year, we have to send that school an additional 10, 15, 20 or more new teachers. One school highly stable, the other school highly unstable. One school where the young people who come in get mentored and taught and supported, and believe you me, there's nothing like that. Another school on which it's catch as catch can. There's very little support. An external PD, as important as it is, will never replace the mentoring and the direct support. One school will have an average teacher salary of $20,000 or even $25,000 more than another school, reflecting the fact that one school is a highly stable, successful organization in which talent teaches talent, reinforces talent, and supports talent. And another school is fundamentally a school that has teachers cycling through there. Those two schools are entirely different communities. And if we are going to change what happens in education, we've got to realize that we're going to have to differentiate incentives and move to pay for performance in order to encourage people to go to take on high needs challenges. Let's be candid with each other. If I pay you exactly the same, whether you teach in a school that has high-performing kids who come to school with all the advantages and are well-behaved, or you teach in a school where the kids are enormously challenging, there's discipline problems, and there's instability. For the same sum, people are going to obviously, time and again, not every human being, but overwhelmingly, choose one over the other. So today, when I'm short math and science teachers in New York City, which I am, it's a product of the intersection of supply and demand. But when I am short math and science teachers, I am short math and science teachers in my highest needs community. My middle schools in my high needs communities don't have qualified math and science teachers, and as a result of that, those kids are not getting the education they need. And there's no reason in the world that the teaching profession should be different from all the other professions out there. What Bradley says on this, teaching is one of the very few professions I know that only rarely rewards improved performance. When I was a basketball player, I knew that if I improved and we won the championship, I'd be paid more. That's also true of lawyers, bankers, and countless other professionals, including college professors. But it's not true for K-12 teachers. They advance according to seniority. Teachers are paid not because they're good, but because they're there. And we have got to change the culture to reward excellence, incent excellence to take on the toughest challenges, and ensure an equitable distribution of teaching talent. 53 years ago in America, 53 years ago, Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education. And we promised, I was in Little Rock this weekend at the Clinton Library, and I got to talk to people who were actually involved in what happened in Arkansas in the Little Rock Central High School case. And here we are 53 years later, and we promised every kid in America an equitable distribution, an equitable opportunity for a good education. We promised that to everyone. And 53 years later, on the fundamentals, because we have a system that eschews accountability, and we have a system that refuses to differentiate its rewards and its consequences, 53 years later, we're not meeting that challenge. I think we can do it, but I think it is going to take a committed citizenry prepared to tackle these significant challenges. Paul Tough was exactly right. If you design a system a certain way, you're pretty much going to get certain results. If you're prepared to design a system differently, then I think you can get very different results. That's why I think those schools that I mentioned that are performing very differently are schools that will chart the way for us in the future. Thank you very much.